Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker from My Favorite Things. Today I have a fun interactive spinner card to share with you. Spinner cards are some of my favorite cards to make. I make them quite often. And we're going to start out by creating the background. It might be hard to tell with the lighting in this video, but the piece of paper that I'm working with right now is not white. It's actually a really light blue. And I have this piece of cardstock cut to 6 by 6 currently, but later I will be cutting it down to 5.5 by 5.5. At the start of the video, you might have noticed that I used a powder bag and I went over this piece of paper so that I could prep it for embossing. And that just helps so that none of this embossing powder that I'm using will stick to areas on the paper that I don't want it to. Even if you just touch the paper, the oils on your hands can get on the paper and embossing powder will stick to those areas. So prepping it with the powder bag first is a really good idea. As you can see, I stamped a bunch of clouds across this background, and I stamped those with Versamark ink, and I embossed them with a white embossing powder. Now, the actual cloud stamps that I used are from an older set from My Favorite Things called Catacorn. Of course, if you're wanting to make a card like this, you could just go through your stamps and find any cloud image that you have. It does not necessarily have to be from this exact set. After the embossing was done, I grabbed 3 colors of Distress Oxide ink. I grabbed the colors Broken China, Salty Ocean, and Chipped Sapphire, and I'm going to create a ombre look on this background, going from a light blue to a dark blue. I did want to leave some of the blue cardstock showing at the bottom, and so when I was blending the Broken China color there, I switched from the sponge tool to the blender brush, and that's because you can get a much softer look with your blend using a blender brush, so I could blend out that color to nothing so that it kind of goes evenly into that cardstock color. Here you can see I used a clean, dry cloth and I wiped off the cloud images, and that's because anytime you use an ink on top of your embossing, some of that ink can sit right on top of the embossed area, and you just want to wipe that away clean so that you can have your nice, clean, embossed lines. Next, I grabbed a white colored pencil, and I'm just going to use that to fill in all of the clouds. And remember, anytime you're using colored pencils, try to work with really light pressure. You don't want to push too hard. The way that you build up the color is by adding more layers. All right, so let's move on to the main focus of this whole card, which is this really cute little image of a bunny and a bear riding on an airplane. This stamp is from the Anywhere With You stamp set, and I stamped it with a Copic Friendly black ink onto some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. I am coloring this in with my Copic markers, and I have the marker caps off to the side so that you can see all of the colors that I used. When I was deciding what color to make this airplane, I thought about the background of my card, which I just made, which is really, really blue. So when I'm trying to pick a color that is really nice with that blue, I want something that's going to pop on that blue. I'm going to go for the complementary color. And the complementary color of blue is orange, so I made the airplane primarily orange. I didn't want the whole plane to be orange because I think that would get a little bit flat and boring, so I went with the analogous colors for the rest of the plane. Analogous means 3 colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, so orange is next to red and yellow, so I added red and yellow to the plane as well, but I did keep it mostly orange. Of course, it's definitely not necessary to use analogous colors and complementary colors and color theory when you're making your handmade cards. That's totally not necessary. But if you do want to take color to the next level, you can look at the color wheel and try to make those decisions, and it will make your cards pop a little bit more. All right, so moving on to making the main sentiment on my card. My card is going to have 2 sentiments on it, but this is going to be the bigger of the 2. I took this stamp from the Mini Birthday Messages stamp set, and I stamped it with Versamark ink onto some navy blue cardstock, and I embossed it with a white embossing powder. After that, I grabbed a circle die and I cut out the sentiment, and that's going to be right in the center of my spinner later on. For my smaller sentiment, I picked out this stamp from the Balloon Bouquet stamp set, which says Happy Birthday Friend, and I'm going to use my MISTI tool to manipulate this stamp and curve it so that I can stamp it along the edge of a circle that I cut out with a die. In order to do that, I did take the die that I cut the circle with, and I taped it on the front of my MISTI tool, and then I can use that as a guide for curving that stamp so that I can stamp it along the border of the circle. And I did actually stamp this a second time. I just turned the circle a little bit and I stamped it again so that I could pick the one out of the two stampings that I liked better and then use that one. So I picked the one that I liked and I used another circle stamp, which is slightly smaller, and I cut along the bottom edge of that sentiment so that I have a curved sentiment. All right, so now it's time to start putting everything together. I took my background and I adhered it onto a piece of 6x6 black cardstock. I then cut out 2 rings out of white cardstock. These rings are the same size as the sentiment that I made earlier, and I also used a slightly smaller circle die to cut the inside of the ring. I'm going to glue these together to make a thicker ring, and this I'm going to glue right to the center of my card, and this is going to be not only a guide for my foam tape, but it's also going to create a little buffer between the paper and the spinner. Next, I have a larger ring that I created with 2 circle dies. Now this one I cut out of the same light blue cardstock as the background, and then I blended Salty Ocean and Broken China Distress Oxide ink onto it so that I could make it match the background. And now I'm taking that curved sentiment that I made earlier, and I'm going to glue that right on the top edge of this ring. So earlier when I was creating that curved sentiment, the circle that I was stamping on was slightly larger than this blue ring so that I could make sure that it would curve really nicely along that edge. I glued the plain image right on top so that it looks like that sentiment is trailing behind the plane. All right, so now let's create our spinner. The first thing that we do is we take a piece of foam tape and we fold it in half so that it's twice as thick, and then cut a really long, thin piece that we can curve around the inside edge of that ring. So I made sure to take the backing paper off of both sides, which makes it easy to curve around into a circle, and I just followed the inner ring as a guide for where to place it. Then you place your spinner so that the foam tape is in the center, and then you close off the spinner with the circle that has the sentiment on it, and that encloses it so that it spins. Now, I realized after I did that I wanted the circle with the sentiment to be larger, so I just quickly made a slightly larger circle and stamped another sentiment, and I glued that right on top. All right, so now I'm going to get crazy with the white gel pen. I had to use my white gel pen on this quite a bit in order to be happy. I couldn't use any embellishments because that could cause the spinner to not spin. And you know I love my embellishments. So instead of using sequins and all of that, I decided to go a little bit crazy with my white gel pen. First, I added a dashed line around that inner circle, and then I added some highlights and details to my plain image. Then I added some dashed lines around the outer border of the blue background, and then I'm going to do a little bit more with it later, but first I added it onto a 6x6 card base. Now, when I need a 6x6 card base, I can't use regular cardstock because it's not big enough. So I do grab my Bristol smooth paper, which is nice and big, and I can get a 6x6 card base out of it. Now, if you don't have paper big enough, you can still turn it into a card by taking a piece of 6x7 cardstock, scoring it at 1 inch on the long side so that you have a 6x6 square and then a 1x6 flap. You add some adhesive to the flap and add that onto the back of your card background, and then you have yourself a card. All right, so here's what I was talking about when I said I went a little bit crazy with the white gel pen. I added all of these stars and dots and kind of wonky looking little clouds in the far background to the upper portion of the card, kind of making it look like an early evening sky. And then, of course, even after all of that, after me thinking I couldn't add any embellishments because it would ruin the spinner, I thought, Well, why can't I add some embellishments to the center? That's not going to make the spinner not spin. So I added a few enamel heart stickers around that middle sentiment, and then this card was all done. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed this video and that it gave you some inspiration. If you've never made a spinner card, I hope that you'll give it a try. They're really fun to make. They take a little bit extra time, but they are really a showstopper. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.